Welcome to The Savvy Patient, where we make medicine make sense.
I'm Dr. Gillian Goddard. I'm an endocrinologist and an expert in women's hormonal health with 2 decades of clinical experience.
I'm Erin Stein, a writer, editor, filmmaker, and media psychologist, but definitely not a doctor.
By looking at the data and breaking down the research, we will help you get savvy. Remember, this podcast is not meant to replace medical advice from your own doctor.
We're going to let Gillian do a lot of the talking during this podcast because she actually studied these things in medical school and has, in fact, written an entire book about it. Maybe we'll just let you start with trying to define what hormones are for those of us who did not go to medical school.
Sure. I actually think we should start even a little bit before that.
Fair enough.
So,
in the beginning.
Okay, not that far back. We won't talk single-celled organisms or anything. The human body is really just a bunch of different networks or systems. So we have the cardiovascular system, we have the respiratory system, we have the nervous system, and all of these systems actually work together and interact with one another to make sure that our bodies function the way they're supposed to. One of those systems is the endocrine system, my favorite system. The endocrine system is made up of glands, and those glands all make hormones. And so that is sort of the framework that we're talking about here.
We often think of the human body as these discrete parts that we put together, like building a transformer or something. But I did take a class in neuroscience and read an entire textbook about the brain. And the thing that I took away is that our brain, while we try to label parts of it, the entire brain works together in every system in our body. There is no real separation that you can make. It's just systems upon systems all layered all together. And so the way you're talking about that makes sense to me because I read a whole book and was like, there is no like one part does one thing.
That's
one
right.
part is a part of multiple systems doing multiple things.
Yeah, we're pretty complex.
Yeah, seemingly very complicated.
Yeah.
Okay, so explain what a gland is.
A gland is an organ that makes hormones. So you have a bunch of them. You have a pituitary gland. It sits straight back behind the bridge of your nose, just below your brain. You have a thyroid gland, which is in your neck. You've got adrenal glands. They're like 3-cornered hats sitting top of your kidneys. If you're a person with ovaries, you have ovaries. And if you're a person with testes, you have testes. The liver, the kidneys actually make hormones. Fat. So fat cells can help produce hormones. There are cells in our stomach that make hormones and cells in our gut that make hormones. The ever-present GLP-1 receptor agonist, the hormone that is based on, is made in the cells of your small intestine. And so while we typically think of glands as being the main hormone producing organs, and they are, there's hormones coming from other places too.
So it's very messy is what you're telling me.
It is.
Okay, so we have glands that are organs, and we also have some organs, and we have fat, all making hormones.
All the time.
While making hormones all the time, it seems like we need them. Why do we need them?
So hormones are instructions that tell a part of our body what to do, to make a protein, to open a channel. I mean, we're talking about things that happen on a really tiny level, to grow cells to line our uterus.
Hormones are all kinds of instructions. It's not like they only participate in one kind of thing that's happening in our body. All kinds of things.
All kinds
that
of
are
things.
Happening.
All kinds of things.
So how do we look at them? How do we organize them? How do you do what you do, Gillian?
Yeah. So usually we think of hormones and glands in feedback loops. So picture 2 people playing ping pong, right? Pretend they're good at it. So maybe not you and me. One of them serves the ball and the other person moves and adjusts a little and hits the ball back. And then the first person moves and adjusts to hit the ball back again. And they keep the ball going back and forth sort of easily, but they're sort of adjusting how hard they're hitting it and where exactly they're hitting it from, to try and keep the ball in play.
Mhm.
So the players in this game are glands,
Okay.
and the ping pong ball is the hormones.
Okay.
I think the easiest loop to think about is the thyroid loop. It's the most sort of straightforward. And so why don't we start with that one as an example?
Okay. Let's start with the easiest one.
So your brain, your nervous system is taking in all kinds of information. It's taking in information like from your environment, from the outside world. Is it hot or cold? It's taking in information from the rest of your body, and it synthesizes all of that in an area of the brain that is also a gland called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus does lots of different things with this information, tons of things. But one of the things it does is it makes these little peptide hormones to tell the pituitary gland to do something. So in this case, in the case of the thyroid, the hypothalamus senses through all of its, inputs that you need more thyroid hormone. So it makes a hormone called thyrotropin releasing hormone. That hormone, TRH, goes to your pituitary gland. Again, pituitary gland sits right behind the bridge of your nose, like where my glasses are. It's tiny. It's the size of a Jelly Belly jelly bean, but it's super important. It gets this signal from the hypothalamus, and in response to that signal from the hypothalamus, the TRH, it makes thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. TSH then travels through the blood to the thyroid and binds to receptors on the cells that make up the thyroid and tells the thyroid to make and release thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is now circulating in your blood at appropriate levels, and it's doing all the things that thyroid hormone does. I like to think of thyroid hormone as sort of like the gas pedal for the body. When you have more thyroid hormone, things happen faster. And when you have less thyroid hormone, things happen more slowly. So it's like pressing on the brake or letting off the brake. But some of this circulating thyroid hormone circulates back to your hypothalamus and pituitary gland and tells the hypothalamus and pituitary gland that you have an adequate amount of thyroid hormone. So then it will dial back the amount of hormone. Both the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland can dial back a little bit the amount of hormone that they're making. They can adjust to how much thyroid hormone is circulating in the body.
Okay, so it's a super complicated text chain between multiple people that somehow does not dissolve into a game of telephone, although I guess that is something that may happen with certain medical conditions.
That's right.
But I don't want to torture this analogy too much. Let's take one step back because we've talked about hormones. They travel around, they go from place to place. In this case, one hormone made another hormone. Like, it's a lot of hormones happening.
It's like alphabet soup too, yeah.
A little bit, yes, or a lot, a bit. So the hormone goes somewhere, like the pituitary, another gland, another organ, another whatever. But you describe the hormone as the instructions. So when the instructions get there, when the text message arrives,
yeah,
who is it talking to? What then does something about it?
Yeah, so the way that hormones act on other glands or other parts of the body is by binding to receptors. Those receptors can either be sitting on the surface of the cell in some cases, or in some cases, the receptors are actually inside the cell, inside the nucleus of the cell. And basically, when a hormone binds to a receptor, it tells the cell to make a protein, to do something. And so it's really the receptor is like the guy at the factory pulling the lever.
He's the Homer Simpson at
Yeah.
the control panel.
Right. Exactly.
The hormones are obviously the instructions, so they're super important, but for a hormone to do its job, it has to match up with that receptor.
Yes, a hormone just floating freely in your blood is not doing anything. It's when the hormone binds to a receptor that you get an action. So there's 3 other main loops and then a bunch of hormones that are not sort of in these main loops. So I like to think of the 4 main loops as the reproductive loop, the growth hormone loop, the thyroid loop, and the adrenal loop. And each of those loops has a sort of main effect. So the reproductive loop is fairly straightforward and obvious. If you are a person with ovaries, it drives ovulation and the menstrual cycle. If you are a man or you have testes, it drives testosterone and sperm production. So all the things we need as humans to make more humans.
Mhm.
The growth hormone loop is most active in childhood when we are in fact growing, but it has some effects especially on blood sugar and body composition in adults, although we don't have very high levels of growth hormone. We do have a little. The thyroid loop, as we said, is the gas pedal for the body. It controls how quickly things get done. And the adrenal loop is our stress response and controls our circadian rhythms. So why do we wake up in the morning or when it's light out? Why do we go to bed at night? Why do we feel like we need a cup of coffee at 3 p.m.? That's all the adrenal loop.
You talked about the thyroid loop as a gas pedal speeding things up, and that made me think about like being stressed out or having my heart beat faster or something like that. But then you talked about the adrenal loop relating to stress. So how are those two different?
The thyroid loop is controlling things sort of on the like day to day, and the adrenal loop kind of revs up and breaks in when the situation is stressful. Does that make sense?
I think so. So thyroid is more like I got up in the morning, so now I'm moving around and things need to start happening again.
Yeah, like I need to um like the food that I ate last night needs to continue on its way through my gut so that I can get those nutrients, for
A
example.
lovely thought. Okay. So those are the basic loops. And then you said there are a bunch of random hormones floating around.
Then there's a bunch of other hormones that are not part of those main loops but are really important. So insulin, for example,
Oh, yeah.
from the pancreas.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it's pretty important. I'm sure we'll be talking about it a lot here. Parathyroid hormone, which has nothing to do with the thyroid whatsoever, except for that the parathyroid glands are next to the thyroid. We like
Learn your
to
Latin.
learn your Latin. um, and then there's many others. For GLP-1 is a hormone, for example, made in cells in the gut. So there are actually dozens of hormones, and there's probably many that we don't know about yet. GLP-1 was only discovered in the 80s and only really understood in the 90s. So
You said fat is a gland,
yeah,
and I don't think people realize that. Explain that to me. So we're always trying to get rid of fat,
we are. And
but how
yeah,
much of it do we need? And do we
yeah.
need the hormone it's making? What's it doing?
Yeah. So the short answer is we need some fat, but not too much. One of the things that we will talk about a lot when we're talking about hormones is this Goldilocks idea, right? Like you don't want too much and you don't want too little. You want it to be just right.
Mm.
And fat is no exception. You need some. Fat does a couple of things. It makes some hormones that affect our appetite and how drives how we eat and what we do with the nutrients that we absorb from eating. It also makes an enzyme called aromatase that converts testosterone into estrogen, which is important both in men and women. For men, the aromatization of testosterone is the main way that they get estrogen, which is important for their bones. In women, this is an important factor in sort of how women experience menopause and perimenopause, and can be a really factor um, in people like yourself who have had breast cancer. The challenge is that there's different types of fat. There's fat that's just underneath your skin called subcutaneous fat, and there's fat that can build up around your organs in your abdominal cavity. That's called visceral fat. And visceral fat has some added activity around making insulin not work as well in our body and predisposing us to things like heart disease and diabetes. And so if we could pick where we put our fat, we would want to put it subcutaneously and not put it around our organs and our midsection. Unfortunately, that's kind of not the way our bodies work.
We don't get to choose.
We don't get to pick. We don't get to pick. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so one thing we didn't talk about yet is that I think is important for some of these medications that we will talk about many, many times over and over again, perhaps, is hormones don't last long.
No. And how long they last
Do
is
any of them
variable.
last long, or they're all here and gone in a moment?
No, so there's kind of two subcategories of hormones. There's peptide hormones. These are simple hormones and they're very short-lived. They often last on the order of minutes. GLP-1 is a peptide hormone. All the hormones we were talking about in the hypothalamus, those are peptide hormones. And the benefit of the fact that those hormones are so short-acting, insulin is also falls into this category. The benefit of these hormones being so short-acting is that the body can change course quickly if it needs to, right? Like if your blood sugar is dropping and you need to keep it at a certain level, the insulin levels can drop quickly. And so that's great. Other hormones last hours, some last days. The half-life of one form of thyroid hormone is about a week. So some hormones can last for very long periods of time. Most hormones last on the order of minutes to hours.
Which is why we need to keep making them all the time.
It is, but it also is what gives the system its flexibility.
I like that. I think that makes sense. Our bodies are doing all kinds of things every second. So,
Right. The challenge is one of the main things that I do in my job is give people back hormones that they're missing. And when we're giving those hormones back, we might want them to last longer than a couple minutes. Um, Otherwise you would be either like popping a pill or having an infusion all the time. That's not very practical.
right, right.
This was a big thing that came up with GLP-1. They discovered GLP-1 and they were like, this would be a great treatment for diabetes, but it only lasts 6 minutes. So like, how are we going to turn this into a medication that can last long enough to be useful?
Let's stick to GLP-1 since you brought it up, because if it doesn't last very long, how did they create a form that will last longer? How did we even figure out? I mean, this is, I guess, a question about all hormones. How do we figure out they even exist? How did they get identified in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, the first way they identified hormones is they would do dissections and they would look at the glands and the stored hormone in the gland, and that's kind of how they discovered these things. I mean, the original treatment for hypothyroidism was to eat the gland of either a cow or a pig, for example, because it has thyroid hormone in it. And we actually there still is on the market desiccated porcine thyroid, like in pills that I can prescribe to people. I don't usually prescribe those, but you can, and some people do take them.
Huh.
So
Science stuff.
yeah, I mean, it's funny, right? Because the thyroids from the pigs are actually like left over after they it's kind of using the whole animal, if you will.
Okay. Yes.
Like eating.
For meat eaters. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's how we first learned about hormones. And then as we became more sophisticated, we were able to start looking at oftentimes different receptors and cells and trying to figure out what hormone went with that receptor and what that hormone must look like. But GLP-1's really fun because they knew we had this hormone. They were trying to figure out how to use it to treat diabetes. And then some scientists at the Bronx VA, which is like a few miles behind me, they discovered that the venom of Gila monsters contains a very similar compound called exendin that's very similar to GLP. But exendin lasts for hours. And so that was actually the basis of the very first GLP-1 exenatide. But even that, compared to what we have now, didn't last very long. You had to take exenatide twice a day. And so then now we have exenatide. We look at that molecule. We look at the molecule of exendin. Chemists start changing things about the molecule that affect how it's metabolized so it can act like the hormone but can last longer in the circulation.
Let's dive down into one specific example that relates to my life.
Yeah.
Which is Tamoxifen is a medication that I am now taking. I had breast cancer last year. I had surgery. And now to reduce my risk of recurrence, I'm on this medication called Tamoxifen, which I had estrogen positive breast cancer. So this medication inhibits estrogen, but they tell me that it only inhibits estrogen to my breasts, but there's other parts of my body, right? That there's estrogen happening, I think. At least one other part.
Yeah. So basically, I think there's a couple things to think about here. So let's start from the beginning. What is estrogen positive breast cancer? It is breast cancer where the cells that make up that cancer have estrogen receptors in the cells. And when estrogen binds to the receptors in those cells, it stimulates the cancer cells to grow. And so the purpose of giving you a medication that blocks estrogen in the cancer cells is to stop any cancer cells that might be in your body from growing.
Right.
Right.
That makes sense.
So, but you have estrogen receptors all over your body. They're in your brain, they're in your bones, they're certainly in your uterus and your ovaries. And so then what is happening in all of those places? Basically, there are different types of estrogen receptors. And what tamoxifen is it's actually a selective estrogen receptor modulator. So what that means is it binds to the receptors for estrogen and modulates them in some fashion. And the reason they call them modulators is because it modulates different receptors differently. So it sits in the receptor and blocks estrogen from acting and blocks estrogen function in some cells, like the cancer cells. And it also acts like estrogen in other places, like your bones. And so the benefit of that is that you get the benefit of blocking the estrogen in the cancer cells without making your entire body deplete of estrogen, which some of the other medicines we use do. And so that means you don't have to worry about having osteoporosis, for example, which is a nice benefit.
Yeah, so that's kind of wild to me and amazing that it can target the receptors in different parts of your body, that the receptors are different enough for the different things that hormone is doing in your body that they can target that specifically.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, isn't it?
It is pretty cool. I have to admit, I was like, I don't really believe it. I feel like
it's true.
How can it only block the estrogen in one part? That doesn't seem possible. But
well, it's binding to any estrogen receptors it comes in contact with. The effect it's having on those different types of receptors is different.
So we don't know everything that our hormones do. You just mentioned, for example, estrogen receptors in the brain. What's that? What does estrogen do in my brain? I just don't know.
We do not have a good handle of all the things that estrogen does in the brain. It probably changes how dopamine functions in our brain. So there's a lot of thinking that it potentiates dopamine. So what does that mean? Helps dopamine to work better in our brain. We don't know exactly how it does that, but we think it does. Brain cells need glucose. They can't run on anything else. They can only run on glucose. Estrogen seems to help the cells, the individual brain cells, do a better job of metabolizing that glucose
Okay.
so that fewer free radicals are released that can damage the cells and cause cell breakdown. Again, we don't know how estrogen does that. Clearly, estrogen acts in the brain, but we don't understand a lot of the detail. This is what I will say. If there are receptors for a hormone in a tissue, that hormone is doing something, whether we know what it is or not.
Fair enough. Fair enough. How are we working on figuring that out? We don't know about all the hormones we have. Are people still discovering new hormones?
Yeah, I mean, every once in a while you hear about a new hormone or a new function of an existing hormone that someone has discovered. I mean, we do this in a number of different ways. And this is how kind of all science on the human body is done. You start with like cells in a petri dish and you see how those cells react, and you can sequence the proteins so that you know exactly what the like shape of these different things are. You can do all of that like as bench science. But then you've got to move into more complex systems than just like cells in a petri dish. So you get to go to usually rats are a common one for
The old
humans.
rats.
Yeah, and they're good for some things, but not good for others. But they're a place to start. And then eventually you have to also try and do studies in people, which can be harder than it sounds to design a good study that gives you the information that you want. And that's a topic we'll be talking about a lot too.
It's just so complicated because you are studying other kinds of creatures that we might have some similarities to. Pigs have thyroids, apparently.
Mhm.
But, like, you're not going to get a one-to-one comparison, but you have to start somewhere. You can't just randomly start experimenting on humans.
We have organizations that
Generally
prevent that.
frown upon that, although it has been done in history. But
Sure.
I think we agree that was bad.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
I
yes,
mean-
we do anyway. So then, but you have to test in humans at some point. So then how do you do it ethically and safely and all
Yep.
that stuff?
And in a way that it gets at the question that you want the answer to, which is harder than it sounds.
No, that's why I didn't go to medical school. We talked about pig parts and cow parts, which is where we started with making synthetic hormones.
Mm-hmm.
Are we still there? Or are we making different kinds of hormones?
In the vast majority of cases, we are not still using animal glands or extracts. So people used to use pituitary extract or bovine
Not
pituitary
the same
extract.
as vanilla extract.
Not the same. Not the same as vanilla extract, no. Now, because we know the shape of these hormones, we can make synthetic forms of these hormones. And in most cases, that is what we are using. So at this point, thyroid hormone, our replacements for cortisol, our replacements for growth hormone, even the estradiol and progesterone that, that people take for various things like hormone therapy, all those things are now synthetics. They're derived from different things. So like the estradiol in an estradiol patch, which is identical to the estrogen that we make in our ovaries, is synthesized starting with plant phytoestrogens. So that we modify.
I've seen some things that are like, oh, we don't want to take drugs or fake things or whatever. Like, are these natural or unnatural?
I would say in general, we have much more control over the amount of a hormone in a synthetic product, and we have much more data on how those synthetic products work. And in many cases, those synthetic products are very close, if not identical, like in the case of estradiol, if not identical to the hormones that our bodies make. We can feel very small differences in hormone levels very easily.
Which we will also talk about in this podcast.
This
we will talk
this is
about feeling our hormones all the time. Okay, we're gonna have a brief interlude because I'm gonna give a setup question to Jillian to tell us what her favorite. Just say it. Just go ahead and say it.
My favorite gland is the placenta.
Yes. So, newsflash, the placenta is a gland
Among other things, but yes.
among other, well, like everything else, among other things. So when you were rattling off glands earlier, you did not mention the placenta.
I was saving the best for
You're
last.
God. Now, I am not a person who has had children, so I have not grown a placenta myself. So to me, I'm just like, ew.
So I have grown
Isn't it just like a sack of goo?
4. It's amazing. You grow a new organ from scratch for every pregnancy, and it's the only organ in the human body that's made up of 2 separate people. It's part mom and part baby. It's incredible. And it churns out tons and tons of hormones in the 40-ish weeks of it, not quite 40 weeks of its existence. It shuts the reproductive loop off and pumps out estrogen and progesterone in huge quantities, higher than we ever have any other time. It's so cool. And then baby is born, the placenta is delivered, and they literally like throw it in the garbage. And the next time you get pregnant, you make a whole new one.
Well, what do you want to do? Keep it in a jar on a shelf?
I mean, people do that, but I wouldn't recommend it.
So it shuts down your reproductive loop, but is it also then essentially functioning as the hormone production factory for the fetus? At what point does the fetus grow its own hormone production factories? I don't know. That's the thought that occurred to me. Like, is it pulling
it's a
all
great
the levers?
question.
Is it getting all the text messages?
So, in the very early stages of pregnancy, so during the embryonic stage, and the to 10 weeks of pregnancy, and then sort of like through the first trimester, it is running the show for fetus 100%. In fact, many of mom's hormones cross the placenta to provide the hormones that the fetus needs. So thyroid hormone, for example, is super important for early brain development. And the thyroid hormone that the fetus gets actually comes from the mom in the very early stages of development. By the midpoint of pregnancy, the baby is actually making their own hormones. It's amazing it ever goes right. So much has to happen.
Well, I mean, that is true. First of all, growing a baby and then giving birth is not a process that is just automatically going to go well. There's
Yeah,
so
no.
many
Yeah.
teeny tiny factors that have to go right for it to go right.
Well, and it's funny because I remember in med school hearing a statistic that said that, like, it was a huge number, and I hate to misquote it, but like 15% of people have a minor birth defect and 3% of people have a major birth defect. And I remember thinking that sounds insanely high.
We all come out differently no matter what, but the fact that we come out at all, I think is impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so Dr. Gillian Goddard, you know a lot about hormones. I think that's clear at the end of this. So, as an endocrinologist in your day job as a doctor, what kinds of hormonal things are you helping people with? Just to give some examples.
I see a lot of women dealing with menopause. A huge portion of the population has type 2 diabetes or some pre-diabetic process that can lead to type 2 diabetes. So I see a lot of people with things like that. I see a lot of women on that same spectrum with polycystic ovary syndrome. That is definitely something we'll be getting into. I see many, many people with thyroid disease, and now increasingly I do a lot of medical weight loss.
We are going to talk about a lot of those things,
Mm-hmm.
especially perimenopause and menopause. Is there a way to, generally speaking, say this kind of a thing might be a hormonal thing?
It's really tricky because your hormones literally affect your entire body. And some of the symptoms can be very vague. So it can be really tricky to say this is a hormonal thing. Certainly if periods are irregular, it's probably a hormonal thing. And it might not be the reproductive hormones, but certainly if periods are irregular, it's probably a hormonal thing. That's a good place to start if you're someone who gets periods. And then beyond that, I think what ends up happening is people start with their primary care doctor, which is great. Primary care doctors know a little bit about a lot of stuff, and so they're a great place to start. And they can do some sort of baseline testing oftentimes and get you sent in the right direction.
Okay. That makes sense. And is very unsatisfactory, but that's fine.
Sorry.
Because we will get into much more specific scenarios in other episodes. People who may think they have an issue with a hormone of some kind in one of these hormonal loops that we talked about, they often refer to it as a hormonal imbalance.
Mm.
And in fact, I was told that as a teenager that I had a slight hormonal imbalance. I started my period very late. That was the reason given to me. I think you might want to address that phrase in some way because I feel like that's what a lot of people hear, what they're told. And so when they go to seek help, they might be saying, I think I have a hormonal imbalance. I need to balance my hormones.
Yeah. It's not
Can
a
you?
thing. No. Because at different times, you need different amounts of different hormones. And so what you want is not so much to have your hormones be in balance. You want the system, the feedback loop, to be intact and functioning properly. So if you go back to the ping pong game, you want the two players to be hitting the ball back and forth and back and forth. You don't want the ball to be flying off and with a, huge thwack flying off in the wrong direction. And so the goal isn't balance, but appropriate function of the whole of the feedback loop that you're dealing with.
I think of it as the ball needs to keep moving back and forth between these two paddles and not, some random third person who shows up or injuring someone in the audience.
And you need the ball.
You need the ball. Yes. Well, that is the hormone, right? So we need there to be a ball. I think that's important.
Yeah.
And then it needs to be functioning in its loop. It needs to be in its loop doing its thing.
Most hormone problems are problems where we have too much or too little of a hormone at the wrong time.
Right. Timing. Timing is everything.
Timing is everything.
So many ways. All right. Well, I'm not going to remember most of these things that we talked about today, but I think through repetition, it'll start to sink in.
Your experience is real, and you deserve to feel your best.
Help us help you get savvy. Send us topics and questions using the email address askask@thesavvypatient.com.
Listen to new episodes on Wednesdays.
Follow us on all the things.
And subscribe to the Savvy Patient Substack.
Please rate, like, and subscribe. And tell all of your friends.